Yes. About my academic career and teaching and editorship of Anthropologica and the future of anthropology and of hunter-gatherer, Bushman studies, hunter-gatherer studies, all interesting things. Let me just say a few things about all of them. I started teaching at Laurier, Wilfried Laurier University, LU. Wilfried Laurier, when I started teaching, was Waterloo Lutheran University. It became Wilfried Laurier for reasons that none of us can really fathom, because Wilfried Laurier, our Prime Minister, only once visited Kitchener, as far as we can be ascertained. Anyway, I started there in 1971. And I was still a PhD student. I was 2 years from getting my PhD. Well, it was so much easier then to get a job. I was interviewed at 3 places, in McMaster, Guelph, 4 places actually, U of W, University of Waterloo, and Wilfried Laurier. And I chose, which was then, as I said, Waterloo Lutheran. I chose the last because a good friend of mine had just started teaching there 2 years before, Laird Christie, and he kind of paved the road. He kind of recommended me, and the interview was all of half an hour, and I was hired. And I liked it because it was a small department. It was part of sociology, and Laird and I, who were the only 2 anthropologists initially, were asked to kind of build up the anthropology department, which before that had been a branch of sociology, to make it an autonomous degree program. So we did that. We set up the honors anthropology and general anthropology programs, which then were degree programs. So I liked the smallness. I also liked the small university, the intimacy of very small classrooms, and the terms were good. So I went with Laurier and have stayed there ever since. And it was so easy to be hired, and I really, really feel very sorry about my younger colleagues nowadays who have much more difficulty finding a tenured position. And I was there for 36 years, built up a nice pension and so on, security. And when I got my doctorate, 2 years later, I was promoted to assistant professor, and then 3 years after that to associate in 1977. And then 6 years after that, in 1983, full professor. And it was a good experience. We, as I said, built up the program. I had 2.5 terms as chair in that period, department chair, which gave me further discretion to develop things in some ways as I saw them, although never really, because I always see the role of chairman very much modeled on the headman of a Bushman band, primus inter pares with very little power, and subject to the, if warranted, to the censure of his colleagues, including ridicule. Which the Bushmen are very good at. That's how they bring their uppity people to bear through this leveling mechanism. We're seeing it at work now in American politics, aren't we? Saturday Night Live, and Donald Trump doesn't like it one bit. Yeah, so I was very happy with my career there, and I had ample opportunity to do research. Funding was provided by the university and from external sources. I was also able to interrupt my teaching and career at Laurier by going to Germany on 3 occasions as visiting professor to University of Mainz and then Frankfurt to the Frobenius Institute and then to Marburg. And that was terrific. I went to a different academic atmosphere, different students, totally different approach to teaching from what we have, not nearly as structured, all in the form of seminars and rather than lectures. The professors over there a professor when he teaches a course gives maybe three or four introductory lectures and then concluding lecture, and the rest is just student seminars. So that was good. And I was the teaching. I was asked about teaching. I was able to develop quite a repertoire of courses. We built up a program, so that meant we needed quite a number of courses. There were very few of us initially, 2, and then a few years later, Andrew Lyons. A year later, we got an archaeologist, Dean Knight. Then Andrew and Harriet Lyons joined the department in 1977, I think, and that was sort of the core group, and we developed what I thought was a very good undergraduate program. So I taught quite a variety of undergraduate courses, but always courses that I enjoyed teaching, rather than courses that were foisted on me or required of me by the dean or whatever. So that made teaching enjoyable because I could teach what I wanted to teach. And that included, as I said earlier, folklore, which is a course I developed, anthropology of religion, hunter-gatherer studies, Bushmen, a whole course on the Bushmen. That was fun. There was one graduate course too, even though we don't to this day, we don't offer a graduate program in anthropology. We do contribute to graduate programs in other departments, and religion and culture offered a master's and then later PhD program, and I taught graduate course there, which I enjoyed, hunter-gatherer cosmology, which I enjoyed teaching because it is in the field of research that I have been on for 25 years. So every time I taught the course, I learned new things from the literature I read, from student papers that were sometimes very good, sometimes not so good. Now, so I enjoyed the graduate course. I enjoyed the other courses too, but the course that I enjoyed the most teaching, really, and that's to my colleagues' surprise all the time, because it's the kind of teaching assignment that everyone at all costs tries to avoid and abhors, and that's 101, Anthropology 101, the introductory course, which initially, it was a 2-term course covering all four branches of anthropology, which was quite daunting because what do I know in terms of my own research, my own interest about physical anthropology or population genetics or archaeology, linguistics. But it was a challenge, and I enjoyed teaching it because, for 2 reasons. Because I do like the holistic perspective of anthropology. I think I mentioned that earlier. To look at, this is the only remaining discipline, although other disciplines might argue the point, that is a truly Renaissance look at the human condition. And I've always liked the Renaissance perspective. And as I said earlier, when I chose my undergraduate course program, when I selected anthropology, it was for that reason, because of its scope. And including interdisciplinarity, I'll talk about that in a minute. So, and every time I taught the course, especially when it was a two-term course covering the four fields, I again appreciated the scope of the discipline, and I had to keep even the basic knowledge I had of all these subfields, which without that teaching them would have become more and more diffuse in my memory, you know, and would have moved to the periphery of my interests. But I had to keep focused on them, and so that's a reason. The other reason is I always enjoyed more than maybe any other students the first year students. I found them always, they had the most interest still in everything. They didn't develop what later students do. I find maybe it's my teaching or sort of lack of interest. They read the student paper while you lecture, you know, stuff like that, on the cell phone. Blasé attitude. There's more interest and desire to learn, I found always in my teaching. Maybe it had to do with the fact that I enjoyed teaching it the most, and thus it was appreciated all the more, and there was a positive feedback loop there, you know? Yeah. And research, too, the question is how I conceive of research. I've always really enjoyed research more than teaching. I like teaching, but later on I developed, became less enamored of it. Maybe I did too much of it. Also, the older I got, the more I felt I became distant from students. When I taught in my early years, I was still close in age to the students. And anyway, but the research, not only have I always enjoyed it, but I enjoy it more and more now, even though I'm retired now and I'm no longer doing research with grant money, but using my own data and using the terrific resource, you know, that the library has. Your library must have it too, where you can electronically, through the internet, through your computer, get access to all the journals, which is terrific. And I like the research. I like getting all these phases, the idea for something when it starts, and then mulling it over, and then what is really enjoyable is reading the literature for it, accepting notes, mulling that over, oftentimes with sleep-disturbed nights intervening when the intellectual ferment in you. All this I like, and then writing the several drafts and editing, and then the revisions when the paper comes back after the appraisers have looked at it. This is enjoyable, and this is something I fortunately can still do now that I'm retired, which I had less time for when I was teaching, of course. When I chaired the department, was in committees and so on. And now I can do it wholly and do it 7-8 hours a day, and it's great. Although sometimes domestic chores keep me from it. Right, and the Anthropologica, that was another thing that I did for a number of years, for 4 years. The journal Anthropologica, which is Canada's anthropology journal, which for a number of years was published under the title Culture, but then came back to Anthropologica, which whenever I went to these German universities, I always checked the journal section in the libraries at the 3 universities, and they all have Anthropologica. Yeah, so it's definitely an international journal. The journal had been in the mid 80s to late 80s at Laurentian University under the capable editorship of Kathy Catherine Mollahan, but she was overwhelmed with it because she had no institutional support. She did everything herself, the production of the journal, the subscription list, the solicitation of manuscripts, the editing. It was a mammoth job, and she found she couldn't do it anymore. So she asked around, and I think at a conference it came about that Andrew then, Lyons and Harriet heard about it, and they said, yeah, we'll take it over. And Andrew for years was the editor of the journal, and I was the managing editor, having to do with the production and also soliciting manuscripts. I did that too, the subscription. And this was fortunately taken over by Wilfried Laurier University Press. They did the production and subscription list very well, much better than I did. And the first year or so I did it, it was very hard, very time consuming, and I was out of my depth. I didn't really know how to do that. During those years that Andrew Lyons and I did the journal together. I mean, he did the line part as the editor. I did, as I said, he did the brain, I did the brawn work on the journal. The subscription went up quite considerably. This is partly because of the press, Laurier Press, and their professionalism. And they changed the format of the journal, which before, as I said, when Cathy Mullen did it, she did it on her computer, with her own word processor, and the journal was redesigned in very nice format by the press, and the subscription list was the subscription, the renewals of sending memos to reminding people of their renewal being due, all that stuff that the press did. But the more important reason was that Andrew was able to get some very good manuscripts during the tenure. When the journal was revised, he was able to attract some good journals, some good special issues were produced. And the one way he and Harriet too, Harriet Lyons and I myself, the three of us did that very conscientiously. Whenever there were conferences we went to, we would go attend sessions with a view to getting manuscripts for the journal, and also approaching individual presenters for the journal, for their paper, which of course all of it was all the time went through the manuscripts were all reviewed, refereed, yes. So the journal, and then in 1993, I was very busy with I got this Shirk grant on the Bushmen Kura Art Project, and I had a sabbatical coming up, and I wanted to really devote myself to the research project, including doing 3 sessions of field work. So I gave up the managing editorship. But Andrew kept it for years after, and I don't know how long he kept it, but I'm not sure who is the editor now. I've lost touch with the journal, except that I'm still a subscriber, of course, and I get whenever it's published. Okay, that was the next question that I see on my sheet is the future of anthropology. Oh, yeah. Well, I could talk about this, and as we all could, all anthropologists, I imagine, for the length of this interview. And I will limit myself to just 1 or 2 points. When I retired in 2007, the then chairperson, with whom I had discussed the matter before, canceled 2 of my courses, the hunter-gatherer course and the Bushman course, especially the hunter-gatherer course. The Bushmen course, I could understand that. You needed a certain expert specialist to teach it. But the reason given was that it's a course on a non-subject. There are no more hunter-gatherers, so why do we need a course on it? Yeah, and I've come across this a few times. This from other people. Can we have a course on something or a discipline, sub-discipline on something that really doesn't exist because there are no hunter-gatherers anymore? Well, that's not entirely true. There are a few here and there, but certainly most of them are not hunter-gatherers. True enough. So what to do with that? Does that mean in an undergraduate program or graduate program, courses on that subject no longer need to be taught? Does that mean the discipline of anthropology no longer needs hunter-gatherer studies? Those are the questions that I mulled in my mind and discussed with my colleague, although I couldn't convince her quite. The hunter-gatherer courses are gone. But I mean, first of all, hunter-gatherers will always be of interest to prehistorians, right? Because 99.9, is it? We'll forget. % we were hunter-gatherers. And prehistorian, many of their sites, Paleolithic sites, were about hunter-gatherers. So hunter-gatherer studies is certainly not dead as far as archaeologists are concerned. And if you have an undergraduate program that teaches, especially the four fields, you need hunter-gatherer, course on hunter-gatherer. So anyway, but that's the more important point is hunter-gatherers may no longer exist as such, but there are the people that the erstwhile hunter-gatherers are still around, who are referred to by some people as post-foragers, right? Post-foraging study. Post-foragers are around, and they are of great interest should be, I think, to anthropology. That's a legitimate enterprise to study that, to try to understand them, and so I'm saying the future of anthropology should include, to me, and this is a sort of parochial partisan point, should not be devoid of hunter-gatherer studies because post-foragers are around. And I think the post-foragers, as they face all these things that I describe in my own work amongst the Bushmen for 50 years, capitalism, consumerism, cash economy, identity politics, expropriation, poverty, disease, AIDS. These are things that these erstwhile hunter-gatherers confront. And they confront them, as far as I'm concerned, in part, in part because they have a hunter-gatherer heritage. They look at these challenges of the new, brave new world that they now live in from a perspective of a foraging. I mentioned earlier, there's such a thing to me as a foraging ethos, a foraging ideology. And when they look at these challenges, I think it would be very interesting for anthropologists, future anthropologists, to look at hunter-gatherers today, how they cope with the challenges of the new realities that they face, from the perspective of their foraging mindset. And I mean, to some extent that has been done. I know, for example, Berlig and Rau, these are two colleagues from Germany at Cologne. They look at urban foragers, as they call them. They call them the peripatetic niche. These are like street people, or in Ireland, in England, the Irish travelers, the Roma, of course. the hobos and bums of the 1930s. These are segments of Western society, you find them everywhere, that are truly social marginals. They fit into the revisionism scheme because they are hunter-gatherers because of circumstances, socioeconomic pressures that in their lives. And Rao and Berlik have looked at these so-called peripatetic foragers by trying to understand their interaction patterns, their values, their mobility patterns in terms of hunter-gatherer models, which I find interesting. So I think what I'm saying from my partisan perspective, that hunter-gatherer studies should not be wiped off the anthropological map or put back on a shelf, archived somewhere to gather dust. It's still with us. It's still something that anthropologists should concern themselves with. The other reason is that so much of going back to the foraging ethos, I think one aspect of this ideological dimension of foraging is tech, traditional environmental knowledge, indigenous knowledge about the environment, about animal, about ecology, ecological interactions, in terms of a connective cosmology, using a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, Sven Usman, in terms of also of what I talked about earlier, of relational ontology, of intersubjectivity between human and animal. That, I think, is a direction that anthropologists could work in tandem with indigenous people, many of them erstwhile hunter-gatherers who have still kept some of that traditional knowledge, to look at challenges of the environment. And the last thing, I don't know, the camera might run out, but what I'm really interested in is the sort of post-humanism, looking at animals as potential subjects for anthropological inquiry. There's a term, I saw it in, Erica Hill wrote an article about this, she's in Alaska, an archaeologist, about anthrozoology, or I would call it therio-anthropology, where you study the human-animal interaction, where the other you study is not a Zulu or an Inuit or a Bushman, but a reindeer, say, where you do field work, ethnographic field work with animals, not as an ethologist. They have different, although now cognitive ethology is going that direction, but from the perspective of an anthropologist who is versed in the hunter-gatherer way of intersubjectivity, where you look at the animal trying to get its own perspective. This Baltic German, von Uexküll, the zoologist, has done pioneered that. And we're over. As a terrific book I just read by Charles Foster, who is actually a zoologist, who has done, Being a Beast, who has done just that ethnographic field. He spent months living in a badger set, trying to live like a badger, or like a deer, trying to, through his body, his sensation, his perception, to understand the world through the eyes of the badger. He even ate earthworms for his diet and stuff like that. I mean, in a way, this is hilarious. And everyone thought he was nuts, But to me, this is an interesting new vista for anthropology, and it has to do with interdisciplinarity. Okay, we're done, right?